the new Commonwealth of Nations. That is to say, a nations not tied in relations of subjugation, but of mutual interest and affection. And in many ways, the payoff was in 1931, 1926 with the Balfour Declaration and the Statute of Westminster in 1931, when the Dominions got their complete independence, the Dominions being Australia, New Zealand, Canada, South Africa, all of whom got their Dominion status in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. The payoff was for Britain for these closer economic ties in the system that followed after 1931, of the sterling area and of an imperial protection policy. So part of this new Third British Empire then is about politics. It's about trying to create the ties, political ties that bind the empire together. Another part, and this is Carey's thesis, is about this phase of the British Empire being made possible, being enabled by a new type of cultural project. That is to say, you have to spread the words about the importance of British culture and its central place in this new Commonwealth of Nations for that political and economic coherence to be made possible. So there are a whole series of new things that develop. The Empire Press Union in 1909 to facilitate the transmission of imperial news. The Empire Marketing Board in 1926 that you heard about before. Probably most famously, and therefore this is why I've stuck this image up, the BBC Empire Service that becomes retitled the Overseas Service in 1939. So the BBC Empire Service is set up in 1932. The British Council, the sort of cultural wing of British representation, of governmental representation abroad, in 1934, and the Colonial Film Unit, which you're going to see a clip of in a minute. By 1945, the British Overseas Service, the old Empire Service, what you know as the BBC World Service, was broadcasting in Arabic, Afrikaans, Bengali, Gujarati, Marathi, Hindi, Tamil, Persian, Thai, Malay, Chinese, that's both Mandarin and Cantonese, Japanese, as well as every single European language. Every single European language. Okay, this was clearly an attempt to project Britain's place culturally through the new media of wireless broadcasting. The economic element of this project, as I said, was to bolster the pound through the operation of the sterling area, which I've talked to you before. Sterling area, of course, set up in 1931, but is subject to a series of crises in 1945, as we've already heard, in 1949, and eventually in 1967. So in 1945, to give you a sense of its collapse in relationship to the dollar, you had £1 to $4 in 1945. 1949, the first devaluation means that the pound is now worth $2.8. By 1967, it has gone down to $2.4. So that's part of it. The other part of it is trying to bolster colonial economies, to make colonial economies more productive, to help facilitate the British economy, and from 1940, the yoking of the project of development to welfare. So the British citizens get their welfare state. From 1940, colonial development acts become primarily about health and education projects in the colonies. And you can see there's a whole series of these development acts in the 1940s and the 1950s. So the standard conceit that the British have about the process of decolonisation, which of course happens because this project, the economic and the political and the cultural project of British imperialism, of that third British Empire, effectively fails. Okay? It effectively fails, and what you have is then an increasingly rapid process of decolonisation after the Second World War. Okay? Now the conceit, the British conceit, is that this process is peaceable and pragmatic. Britain gets out, and it gets out without violence, and it gets out pretty much on its own terms. And the years of 1947, 1948, where you get independence for all of those countries that you can see listed, are often held to be the classic illustration of that. Okay? Which of course nicely ignores the key role of colonial nationalism in all of those countries. Indeed, the conceit goes even further, because Britain's then pointed to the ensuing violence in the partition of India and Pakistan, in Palestine and in Burma, in the absence of British rule. So the Brits said, look what happens when the British Empire gets out. You know, we've been the civilizing force. As soon as we leave, these countries fall into the type of endemic violence that we've been able to hold at bay during our rule. It wasn't, of course, quite that straightforward. Britain fought a number of counterinsurgency campaigns against colonial nationalist movements, but particularly in the 1950s, in places like Ghana, Malaya, Egypt, and the example that I'm going to give you here today of Kenya. Okay? In the 1950s, you have a very dramatic suppression of the Mau Mau movement in Kenya. In the space of 4 years, it's estimated that between 160 and 320,000 people were forcibly detained in concentration camps, where they were subjected to forced labour conditions, starvation rations, and many cases of rape. Again, the figures are hard to pin down, but estimates vary between 130 and 300,000 deaths. This was a hugely contentious thing. It was, again, one of those occasions, as with the South African War, when people in Britain who were concerned about not just the forms of British imperialism, but the existence of British imperialism itself, began to voice their criticisms. So, in respect to the Kenya, you have people both in the Conservative Party and the Labour Party being deeply critical of British government tactics in Kenya. This is going to be the first time that you hear this name, but it's going to be very important in the coming lectures. A man called Enoch Powell on the Conservative Party argued during this that the Tory party must be cured of the British Empire and the pitiful yearning to cling to the relics of a bygone system. For Powell, the violence in Kenya was a desperate attempt to hold on to an empire that Britain should never have got in the first place, or so he had convinced himself by the middle of the 1950s. Similarly, Barbara Castle on the Labour Party led a series of critical questions and campaigns against that movement. You also have new types of political movements developing, most famously the movement of colonial freedom in 1954, which was critical of the Labour Party's official policy of not supporting colonial nationalist movements. The Labour Party sat on the fence, and it refused to come out as an anti-imperial party, And so people on the left of the party, like Barbara Castle, like Anthony Wedgwood Benn that you saw in the TV and radio room in the campaign in 1959, and 70 other Labour MPs joined up, formed the movement of colonial freedom. By 1960, when Macmillan does his famous Winds of Change speech, saying the winds of change are spreading through Africa, basically the game is up, you see that an enormous numbers of countries get independence. Ghana, Malaya in 1957, Somaliland, Nigeria and Cyprus in 1960, Sierra Leone, Southern Cameroons, Tanganyika in 1961, Jamaica, Trinidad, Uganda, 1962, Singapore, Zanzibar, Kenya, 1963, Gambia and the Maldives in 1965, Tonga and Fiji in 1970, leaving Britain, of course, with Hong Kong, Rhodesia, the Gibraltar, and the Falkland Islands. Okay, so pretty much two rocks, a treaty port, okay, that was about to expire, and a bunch of racist white settlers in Rhodesia that no one wanted to upset. Okay, so much for the Great British Empire. But the pace of that process was phenomenal in the late 50s and early 1960s. It really was like a pack of cards that collapsed. And the point that I want to make is that that never seemed inevitable until very, very late. Yeah? Any questions? No? Good, because I've got a lot to get through in this section, and then I will stop and show you something. Okay, so the third part of this story is that of colonial migration and the transformation of Britain itself. One of the myths that surrounds the frequent retelling of the arrival of Britain as a multicultural and multiracial society is that it all happened in 1947 with the arrival of this ship at the Empire Windrush and another one called the SS Orbiter from the Caribbean. Can't believe I just said the Caribbean, but I did. From the Caribbean. That makes me feel better. Now we know that that is a fiction because there had been substantial trans-imperial migration before 1947. And that's important because one of the default positions in this in the popular imagination in Britain is that colonial migration only comes as an effect of decolonization. In short, we gave up the empire and then they all bloody well arrived in our country. Okay? And that's a complete fiction. You have a series of forms of labour migration that go back into the 19th century with the Irish, Chinese and the Jewish populations that we talked about in the late 19th century. You have the so-called coloured seamen, the merchant, the workers working in the merchant shipping industry in the 1920s and the 1930s. So much so that in 1933 you have the foundation of the first black political organisation, the League of Coloured Peoples, in 1933 and 1951. Okay, and I'm going to be using these terms coloured and black